No armies marched, no banners were raised, yet an entire region of Japan froze in fear overnight. Because sometimes war doesn't announce itself, sometimes it arrives in silence. If you enjoy history without myths and romanticism, subscribe to Fragments of History, leave a like, and comment where you're watching from. The year was 1562, and the province of Koga had seen war before. Not the catastrophic kind that erased entire clans, but the manageable kind. Seasonal campaigns, predictable sieges, battles that followed rules everyone believed were fixed. The samurai who garrisoned the regional castles had settled into a rhythm that felt less like danger and more like routine. Castle Mizukage rose on elevated ground, watching the valley's main trade route. Its stone walls were old and reinforced, layered with generations of careful work. 300 samurai held the garrison, supported by twice that number of attendants, laborers, and clerks. From the keep, Lord Takeda Nobushige governed with the calm certainty of a man whose family had ruled this territory for 4 generations. His confidence wasn't theater, it was arithmetic. A frontal assault on Mizukage would be costly. The nearest rival lord, Uesugi Kagetora, could field forces roughly equal in size, enough to threaten, not enough to guarantee victory. Neither side held the kind of advantage that forced an ending, and so the region lived in an uneasy equilibrium, broken now and then by skirmishes that proved nothing and settled less. That balance created something more dangerous than fear. It created predictability. Takeda's scouts watched Uesugi's movements. Uesugi's informants traced Takeda's supply lines. Both sides knew more or less what the other was doing, and because they believed they understood it, they planned like men playing chess. War became strategic, calculated, and above all, comprehensible. Inside the castle, daily operations reflected that belief. Guard rotations followed fixed schedules posted in the barracks. The gates closed at sunset without variation. Patrol routes traced the walls and grounds in patterns that hadn't changed in years. Efficiency came from repetition. Repetition came from assuming tomorrow would resemble today. Even the council meetings moved like clockwork. Every third evening, Lord Takeda convened his officers to review intelligence, resources, and threats. The process was old, formal, and deeply reassuring. The commander spoke of readiness, the quartermaster counted supplies, the administrator summarized correspondence, and the lord made decisions as though the world could be managed by orderly reports. Information flowed through channels everyone trusted. Scouts reported up the chain. Merchants shared rumors at the gates, while clerks wrote down anything useful. Messengers delivered sealed letters to be opened, read, and filed according to procedure. The system worked because the system was familiar. It moved in straight lines. It made sense. The castle began to resemble a machine, complex, disciplined, dependable, each piece performing its role, each man certain his position mattered. Security existed, of course, but it was built for the threats they recognized: walls to resist armies, gates to stop unauthorized entry, watchtowers to spot approaching forces, inspections to keep weapons ready for battles fought with swords, spears, and arrows. Everything assumed the same thing. If danger came, it would be seen. An army raised dust. Campfires revealed a position. Siege equipment required transport. Attackers made noise, demanded space, carried banners. Defense meant detection, and detection meant watching the horizon. What the castle did not account for was invisibility. Its weakness wasn't in the stone, it was in the assumptions beneath it. The drainage system, built to carry waste away, had never been designed as a security problem. Servant quarters connected to storage corridors that guards rarely walked because servants weren't considered a threat. The administrative wing, where sensitive documents were kept, locked its doors at night and relied on a single guard. One man, alone, whose shift was more sitting than watching. None of this felt like negligence. It was practicality. Why guard a drainage outlet when the real danger was a battering ram? Why patrol servant corridors when enemy soldiers would come shouting? Why stack men outside an office when the castle itself was the perimeter? Lord Takeda occasionally heard whispers of another kind of warfare, stories of infiltrators, of stolen messages, of specialists who moved through darkness and left no trace except consequences. But he dismissed most of it as exaggeration. Criminality dressed up as strategy, or propaganda meant to unsettle the imagination. Honorable war, he believed, happened openly. Men faced men. Protocols were understood. Anything else was beneath serious consideration. His commander, for all his caution, was shaped by the same limits. He had fought in 7 campaigns, commanded men in major battles, survived sieges that lasted long enough to teach hunger and exhaustion. To him, war was violent and direct, decided by force applied in full view. The idea that war could be won without battle sounded like a contradiction, like claiming you could drown without water. On the evening of the 23rd day of the 6th month, everything began exactly as it always had. The gates closed at sunset. Guards took their posts. The kitchen prepared the garrison's meal. Lord Takeda dined with his senior officers and spoke of routine concerns. A boundary dispute with a neighboring village, repairs needed before winter, arrangements for the autumn harvest. After dinner, he retired. The castle settled into its night rhythm. Some men practiced forms in the yard, others gambled in the barracks. A few wrote letters home with ink that dried slowly in the humid air. It wasn't silence, not truly. It was the sound of organized life. Hundreds of people enclosed by stone, absorbed in small, ordinary concerns. The kind of night that makes danger feel distant. No one noticed the first signs. Why would they? Nothing visible had changed. But beyond the walls, in the dark, where watchtowers saw only stillness, an operation planned for months was finally beginning, and by the time the castle understood what was happening, it would already be too late to stop it. The first anomaly came at the hour of the boar, around 10 in the evening. A torch on the eastern wall went dark. That alone meant nothing. Torches failed. Oil ran low. A guard replaced them as routine maintenance. The samurai assigned to that section walked over to relight it from the nearest flame, except the adjacent torch was out too, and the one beyond that. He stopped. 3 torches dying at once wasn't normal. But it wasn't impossible. Bad oil, maybe. Contamination in the batch. He called to his partner to bring a replacement from the guardhouse. No answer. He turned. His partner's post was empty. Unease tightened into something sharper. Abandoning a post wasn't a mistake. It was a punishment waiting to happen. The guard moved toward the guardhouse, his hand finding the sword at his hip, not because he had a clear threat in mind, but because he suddenly didn't trust the dark. Inside, he found his partner slumped against the wall, breathing, unconscious. No wounds, no struggle, just collapsed, like sleep had taken him mid-shift. That should have been impossible. The guard ran for the alarm bell. It was mounted precisely for this. One pull, and the whole castle would hear. He grabbed the rope and yanked. Nothing, no ring, no vibration, only the rope sliding in his hands. He pulled again, harder, then leaned closer, squinting into the dim. The clapper was gone. Not broken, removed, taken away with intent. Someone had been here. Someone had touched the bell and left without being seen, and now the eastern wall was nearly black, one torch after another extinguished until the section vanished into darkness. The guard could hear his own breathing, too loud, too close, and the distant ordinary noises from deeper in the castle. As if life continued without noticing, the edge of the world had disappeared. Where were the other men? He broke protocol and ran toward the keep, moving through darkness that seemed to thicken with every step. Behind him, movement, a shift of air. He spun, nothing, only the place where light should have been. At the south gate, something else was wrong. The night watch commander was midway through his hourly inspection when he found the secondary gate, normally sealed from dusk until dawn, standing open, not forced, not damaged. The bar that held it shut was leaning against the wall, placed carefully, as if someone wanted it to look intentional. as if someone wanted him to notice it and believe it had been opened from the inside. He ordered a check. 2 guards moved through the opening to verify the outside perimeter. They disappeared into the darkness beyond the wall. 10 minutes passed, then another. The commander sent 2 more. They reached the edge of the torchlight and hesitated. One called back that he could see nothing, no movement, no sign of the others. Then his voice stopped mid-sentence. The remaining guard stumbled backward through the gate, eyes wide, breathing hard. The opening behind him suddenly looked less like a gate and more like a mouth. "Something's out there," he said, forcing control into his voice. "I don't know what," but a scream cut across the castle from the eastern wall. Then silence. The commander didn't debate. He ordered the gate shut and barred, then sent a runner to alert Lord Takeda. The runner sprinted toward the keep, crossing the main courtyard where everything still looked normal. Torches burned in the residential quarters. Stable hands settled horses. Guards stood at stations, upright and unaware. The illusion held until he reached the administrative wing. The corridor outside the Lord's chambers was empty. 2 guards should have been there. Not wounded, not dead, gone. He knocked once, then again, harder, calling Lord Takeda's name. No response. Protocol said he couldn't enter without permission, but the castle was already slipping beyond protocol. He pushed the door open. The room was empty, the sleeping mat untouched, armor in its rack, swords in their stand. Everything in place except the man who should have been here. Elsewhere, distraction arrived with flame. Small fires had started in 3 separate locations: the granary, the armory storage building, and a watchtower. Each blaze was controlled enough not to spread immediately, yet serious enough to demand manpower. Guards rushed to contain them, pulling men from posts, turning watch into labor, light into smoke. And while they focused on what they could see, other things moved where they couldn't. The castle's chief administrator was in his quarters, reviewing supply ledgers when an assistant arrived, breathless, with urgent news. Lord Takeda needed him in the war room immediately. The administrator gathered his writing materials and hurried through the corridors, mind already calculating what kind of crisis would summon him at this hour. The war room was empty. He waited, irritation turning to confusion. Minutes passed. Then another messenger arrived, insisting the Lord was not in the war room at all, but in the council chamber, and wanted the administrator there instead. He went. The council chamber was empty too. He stood alone in the vacant room, ledgers clenched in both hands, and felt the truth settle into him like cold water. Someone was moving people around the castle like pieces on a board, separating them, redirecting them, ensuring no one stayed where they belonged. By midnight, even the most disciplined men could no longer pretend this was coincidence. Torches went out across multiple sections. Guards vanished from posts. Messengers sent to investigate didn't return. Fires kept appearing, always manageable, always multiplying, always stealing attention. Orders spread through the corridors, orders that contradicted each other, sending troops to quiet corners while real problems deepened in the dark. The military commander tried to regain control by gathering senior officers in the main barracks. He needed a clear count, a map of what had been compromised, a plan. But when he sent runners to summon the officers, he discovered the messenger corps. The young samurai, trained for rapid communication, had been scattered across the castle by false errands and conflicting instructions. Some were trapped in the eastern section where the lights had died. Others had been sent to distant wings and never returned. The few who remained could not be everywhere at once. Without communication, the commander was blind. And in that blindness, something new took root. Fear. Not the clean fear of facing an armed opponent, something training prepared you to meet with posture and steel, but a crawling fear without shape. A fear of not knowing where the danger was, or what it even looked like. Every sound became suspicious. Every shadow became possibility. Every patch of darkness felt occupied, whether by an enemy or by nothing at all. And somewhere inside that expanding confusion, while the defenders chased fires, searched corridors, and waited for answers that never arrived, the real operation continued, quietly, exactly as planned. By the second hour past midnight, Castle Mizukage had mobilized for combat. Samurai strapped on armor, drew steel, and assembled into disciplined formations, the standard response to a coordinated assault. The military commander moved with practiced certainty, placing troops at choke points, reinforcing the main gates, setting men where an enemy would have to break through. Everything was prepared for the attack that logic insisted must be coming. No attack came. The courtyard lay empty beneath a moonless sky. Beyond the walls, there were no campfires, no movement on the roads, no distant shouts or marching feet. Scouts pushed to the outer perimeter and returned with the same report again and again. Nothing. No armies, no siege equipment, no sign that any hostile force was even nearby. And yet the castle was clearly under attack. The evidence was everywhere. Only the attackers were nowhere. 3 senior officers were dead, not slain in combat. No wounds that suggested a fight. The first was found in his quarters, collapsed over his evening meal. Poison was suspected, but nothing could be confirmed. The second lay at the base of a watchtower stairwell, neck broken in a fall that looked wrong, but offered no proof. The third never woke. His body bore no marks at all, only a small puncture at the neck that could have been an insect bite. Any one of these could be filed away as misfortune. Together, they were a message. The water supply failed next. Not poisoned. Poison would have been obvious, treatable, containable. This was contamination. Something introduced into the source that fed the main well, likely outside the walls, beyond the reach of men who couldn't abandon their posts. Guards who drank from it doubled over within hours, racked with violent illness. Not enough to kill them. Enough to remove them. Communication collapsed after that. Messages from the keep to the walls arrived late or not at all. Orders contradicted each other. Runners delivered statements their superiors later swore they had never issued. Someone was intercepting the lifeblood of the castle, either silencing messengers or turning them into carriers of confusion. The commander tried to strip chance from the system. He chose runners he knew personally, men he trusted with his own life, and sent them with short, direct instructions. Of the 5, 2 vanished between the keep and their destinations. One returned claiming he had delivered the message, but the recipient insisted no one had come. The remaining 2 completed their routes, yet even that felt meaningless, because by then the commander no longer trusted the mechanism itself. Without reliable communication, coordination died. The garrison fractured into isolated pockets, each defending its own corridor, its own wall section, its own gate, blind to what was happening elsewhere. The isolation fed the pressure. You couldn't know if the fires were real or diversions, if missing guards were dead or reassigned, if the order you received came from authority or from an unseen hand guiding you toward emptiness. Then the supplies began to vanish, not looted, not ransacked, taken with precision. In the armory, swords and spears stood untouched, but bowstrings had been cut, cleanly, quietly. A castle with bows that cannot draw becomes a fortress, forced to wait until the enemy is already at the gate. In the stables, the horses weren't poisoned or stolen. They were sedated, alive, breathing, useless. In the granary, the stores remained intact, but the day's rations prepared for distribution were tainted with something that caused immediate vomiting. Small incidents, manageable on paper. Together they added up to paralysis, weapons you couldn't fully use, horses you couldn't ride, food you couldn't keep down, water that crippled you, orders you couldn't trust, and no way to coordinate an answer to any of it. Lord Takeda was still missing. The search became systematic, then desperate. His chambers were undisturbed. His armor remained in its rack. His swords rested where they always had. The guards who remained swore he had retired normally. He hadn't left the keep, and yet he wasn't in his quarters, not in any room he favored, not in any corridor that led away. His absence punched a hole straight through the command structure. The military commander could give tactical orders, but the decisions that carried legal and political weight, summoning reinforcements, negotiating, abandoning the castle, required the Lord's authority. Without Takeda, every directive felt provisional. and officers began pulling in different directions on incomplete information. Some demanded immediate messages to allied clans. Others warned that reaching outward would only expose weakness. A few argued for evacuating non-essential personnel before the situation worsened. Most rejected that as cowardice and insisted on holding the castle at all costs. Hours bled away into argument, and the argument itself may have been part of the attack. Leadership divided, time consumed, control leaking away while the real objectives were completed unseen. By the approach of dawn, the garrison had suffered no major battle losses. Perhaps 20 dead. Officers, guards, support personnel against a force of more than 300 combat-ready samurai. By conventional assessment, the damage was contained. The walls stood unbreached. The gates held. Most troops were still armed. But the castle was effectively defeated, not by superior force, by superior understanding of what makes a military force function. An army without leadership becomes a crowd. Soldiers without communication can't coordinate. Warriors without reliable intelligence can't tell threat from shadow. A garrison that can't trust its water, food, and orders is already broken, no matter how many swords it carries. All night, the samurai had searched for an enemy to fight. They followed inherited protocols. They did everything right according to their training. And they were dismantled by an opponent they never saw, using methods they didn't understand, pursuing objectives they could not even identify until the damage was done. As grey light began seeping over the walls, the military commander stood in the main courtyard, surrounded by exhausted men whose fear had nowhere to focus, and tried to form new orders. Orders for what? Defend against whom? Respond to which threat? The night had proved something terrifying. You could lose a war without anyone ever drawing a sword in anger, but if no army had attacked Castle Mizukage, if no visible force had besieged its walls, then who had just won this impossible victory? And how had they turned a fortified garrison into isolated, confused victims without ever revealing themselves? The operation against Castle Mizukage hadn't begun that night. It began 3 months earlier with a single question. Lord Uesugi Kagetora asked an intermediary, someone who knew people with specialized skills, one measured thing: can Takeda's castle be neutralized without a siege? The reply came back within days. Yes, but not through conventional means. What followed was not a campaign of marching banners. It was intelligence work, slow, patient, and impossible for any conventional army to sustain. The specialists, Shinobi drawn from networks rooted in the mountain villages between the two domains, began not with weapons, but with observation. A merchant who traveled the road between provinces started paying closer attention during visits to the castle town. He watched the walls the way other men watched prices. Which guards stood where? How often rotations shifted? Which gates opened, which stayed sealed, and when? His questions sounded harmless, even bored. How many mouths did the garrison feed? Which supplies were ordered most often? Which farmers delivered rice, and on what schedule? A traveling monk requested permission to stay at the temple for a few days of meditation. His devotion appeared genuine because it was. He was no actor, but he also understood that faith and information were not opposites. People spoke freely around a holy man, assuming spiritual authority meant political neutrality. He listened without prying, noted layouts, counted steps, marked water sources, watched the daily rhythms of guards and servants as if they were part of the prayer. A craftsman was hired to repair damage in the drainage system. He spent a week in the tunnels beneath the walls, working with a precision that exceeded what his contract required. He mapped the channels, measured openings, identified which routes connected to which wings, which passages were inspected, and which had become invisible simply because no one believed they mattered. None of these people were warriors in the accepted sense. No armor, no swords, no ranks, but they were collecting what would become the foundation of an invisible assault: knowledge. The information flowed back through networks with no formal banners and no official structure. Yet they operated with brutal efficiency. A village elder who coordinated local shinobi activity compiled reports, identified patterns, and built a working map of Castle Mizukage more detailed than anything Takeda's own administrators maintained. The plan that emerged was surgical. Don't test the castle's strengths. Go around them. Don't strike where defenses were thick. Strike where assumptions were strongest. Don't fight soldiers. Strip away the systems that made soldiers effective. The team assembled for the night itself numbered fewer than 30. Most were locals, farmers who knew every path through the region, servants who had worked in castles and understood their internal geography, craftsmen who understood how buildings were put together and therefore how they could be undone. A handful were specialists, silent movement, lock manipulation, chemical compounds that could sicken without killing or kill without leaving clean answers behind. They entered through routes the guards weren't watching because the guards didn't know those routes existed. Drainage channels, a supply tunnel connecting the outer town to the kitchens, a ventilation shaft in the temple that opened into the administrative wing, a servant entrance secured by a lock that could be opened in under a minute by someone who knew its exact mechanism. Once inside, they moved with the certainty that only reconnaissance can provide. They knew which corridors would be empty at which hours. They knew what happened during rotation changes. They knew where the blind spots were, not because Takeda's security was incompetent, but because security meant to stop armies is not designed to stop individuals who look like they belong. Their first actions were coordinated to produce maximum confusion with minimum visibility. Torches were extinguished with oil that smothered flame without smoke. Alarm bells were disabled by removing key components while attention was elsewhere. Guards were sedated with compounds absorbed through brief contact. No struggle, no noise. Minutes later, a samurai collapsed, and by then, the hand that touched him was already gone. The fires were not accidents, they were distractions, placed to drag manpower away from critical areas. While guards rushed to keep the granary from catching, operatives moved through the administrative wing copying documents. While attention fixed on the armory blaze, someone was cutting bowstrings and contaminating prepared rations. The poisonings, though even that word implies something louder than what happened, were aimed at leadership, not to slaughter everyone. To remove the right men at the wrong moment. The officer who died over his meal had ingested a compound that induced heart failure, resembling natural collapse. The officer found at the base of the stairwell had been drugged first. The fall arranged once his body couldn't resist. The third had been given a neurotoxin through a needle so fine it left almost nothing behind. Lord Takeda himself wasn't killed. He was taken. While the castle spiraled, while guards chased fires and commanders tried to restore order, a small team entered his chambers through the ventilation system, sedated him, and removed him the same way. He lay unconscious in a farmhouse 5 miles from the castle, guarded and unharmed, a hostage whose absence the garrison hadn't yet fully understood. The psychological dimension mattered as much as the physical. Every action was designed not only to damage, but to destabilize certainty. Contradictory orders weren't random. They were written to sound legitimate while pulling troops away from what mattered. Missing guards weren't all killed. Some were simply relocated, creating the impression of higher casualties and deeper breach. The water contamination wasn't lethal by design. Dead soldiers would have unified the garrison in fury. Sick soldiers created doubt, fear, suspicion. Fear multiplied everything. A castle infiltrated by fewer than 30 men began to feel like it was surrounded by an invisible army. Each small disruption suggested a larger pattern. Each disappearance implied a force with depth and numbers. The defenders' imaginations became weapons turned inward, transforming manageable problems into perceived catastrophe. This was the operation's true genius: scalability through knowledge, not force. 30 people could not fight 300 samurai, but 30 people who knew the geography, understood the routines, exploited the assumptions, and moved unseen through the castle's spaces could paralyze those 300 warriors without ever meeting them blade to blade. By dawn, The Shinobi had completed their objectives and withdrawn. Most were gone before the garrison even understood infiltration had occurred. A few remained behind, disguised as servants, minor functionaries, watching to ensure the effects held, ready to respond if anything threatened the plan. They left no banners, no declarations, no visible signature beyond the damage itself. Mizukage's defenders would spend days trying to piece together what happened, following false leads, suspecting the innocent, hunting enemies who had already vanished. But the most devastating part of the operation was not what the Shinobi did to Castle Mizukage. It was what this single night would do to every samurai's sense of safety across the region. As dawn fully broke over Castle Mizukage, the military commander stood in the courtyard and faced a reality his training had never prepared him for. He commanded 300 armed warriors who were functionally useless. The armor they wore, elaborate suits that took craftsmen weeks to build, designed to deflect arrows and turn sword strikes, offered no protection against an enemy who refused to fight. Chest plates that could stop a spear thrust couldn't prevent contaminated water. Helmets that guarded the skull couldn't shield against drugged food. Armored sleeves that turned blades aside offered no defense against a substance absorbed through brief contact. Dozens of samurai stood in full battle dress, heavy with equipment that had become almost ceremonial. The weight slowed them. The plates narrowed vision. Hours in armor exhausted men who had been ready since midnight. This was gear built for a battlefield, useless against the kind of warfare that had just hollowed them out. The swords were no better. Every man carried a blade that represented years of training, a weapon perfected over centuries. But you couldn't fight shadows with steel. You couldn't cut an enemy who would not stand and be seen. The finest sword in Japan meant nothing if there was never a moment close enough to swing it. Some younger samurai argued for pursuit, hunt the infiltrators through the countryside, drag them into open combat, where samurai strength would decide everything. The older officers understood the trap. Pursue whom? The servants who had worked here for years and might have helped or might not. The merchants who came and went, the farmers in surrounding villages. How do you identify an enemy who looks like everyone else and disappears into ordinary life the instant the work is done? The code of honorable combat, so central to samurai warfare, had become a weakness. Bushido demanded open confrontation, named opponents, recognized rules. It assumed combat was between identified warriors who accepted the same structure, but the night had proven honor was optional, and those who ignored it held the advantage. A duel had always been the clean answer to conflict. Single combat, witnessed, decided by skill and courage. It was ritual and proof, a way to resolve disputes without unraveling the world. But how do you challenge someone when you don't know their name, can't find their location, and aren't even certain they exist as an individual rather than a network? Their response time had been catastrophically slow, not because the men were sluggish, but because the entire structure was built for conventional war. When torches went out, they relit them. Reasonable if it's maintenance, fatal if it's sabotage. When guards vanished, the first assumption was accident, desertion, fatigue, not coordinated removal. By the time the garrison understood they were under attack, most of the damage was already done. Their training worked against them. Samurai were taught to read visible indicators, approaching forces, drawn weapons, hostile movement. But the infiltrators moved among them disguised as non-threats, servants, messengers, repairmen. The garrison had been trained to disregard the very faces that were undoing them. Then trust broke. The commander looked across the assembled troops and could no longer be certain who was loyal. Had some guards been bribed, coerced? Were some servants still inside, waiting to strike again? Was someone within his own chain of command feeding information outward? That suspicion crippled them more thoroughly than any blade. Every order now carried a second question. Will this be intercepted, twisted, turned against us? Every messenger might be compromised. Every report might be bait. Unity requires trust, and trust had become impossible. The chain of command fractured next. With Lord Takeda missing, the commander should have held absolute authority, but officers were dead or absent, leaving gaps that swallowed clarity. Junior men who normally deferred to senior leadership were forced to decide alone. Some decisions contradicted others. Confusion spread through the ranks in broad daylight. Worse still, authority itself began to decay. A young samurai asked his captain openly whether obedience had made them vulnerable, whether rigid adherence to protocol had created the opening this invisible enemy exploited. The captain had no answer. Discipline was the spine of the garrison, but discipline had led them step by step into defeat. The psychological damage exceeded the physical. Samurai were trained to face death with composure, to accept destruction if it came on a battlefield, but this was not death in combat. This was helplessness, being undone by an enemy you couldn't fight, by methods you couldn't counter, for reasons you couldn't fully grasp. Some warriors showed visible fear for the first time in their careers, not the controlled fear before battle, the kind you can burn into aggression, but the creeping fear of exposure, of vulnerability, of standing armed and armored and still defenseless. These were men who would charge into volleys of arrows without hesitation, yet now flinched at shadows, because shadows might hide something a sword could not reach. Morale, everything that separates soldiers from an armed crowd, began to collapse. Men whispered in clusters, trading theories. Most were wrong. All made the world feel worse. The strongest warriors in the province had been made powerless, and that feeling spread like contagion. By mid-morning, the commander faced an impossible choice. He could hold the defensive posture, keep troops ready, and investigate, while remaining inside a castle that was clearly compromised, drinking water that might sicken them again, eating food they could not trust, maintaining routines already exploited. Or he could evacuate, abandon the castle to an enemy that had taken it without ever occupying it. Admit defeat in a way that would humiliate the clan and invite rivals to strike, smelling weakness. Either choice felt like surrender, and the worst realization, the one that settled last, was that there was no good option. The operation had been designed to leave only losing responses, to force every decision into disadvantage. The samurai had been made helpless not by superior force, but by superior understanding of how their own system worked, and how easily it could be turned against them. Full daylight brought a clarity that somehow made everything worse. What had felt like chaotic catastrophe in the night resolved into something far more disturbing in the morning, a precisely executed operation, measured to the edge. The scope was only now becoming visible, because now they could finally see what had been done, and what had been left untouched on purpose. The fires were the first proof. They had been perfectly controlled. The granary showed scorch along one wall, but the grain stores were intact. The armory storage building looked dramatic from a distance, blackened beams, scorched plaster, but the weapon reserves hadn't been reached. The watchtower had burned enough to force an evacuation, not enough to collapse. Each fire had achieved exactly what it needed to achieve, a visible crisis demanding immediate response. Men ran toward smoke, orders concentrated around flame, guards left posts, resources moved. Attention narrowed, right on schedule. In daylight, even the placement felt deliberate. The three fires formed a triangle enclosing the castle's administrative center. While defenders rushed to the perimeter to fight what they could see, the interior, where sensitive documents were kept, where command decisions were made, where Lord Takeda should have been, had been left exposed. The fires weren't acts of destruction. They were tactical diversions, drawn with geometric precision. Then the investigators began checking the defenses, and the castle started to feel unfamiliar. The drainage system, supposedly repaired 3 weeks earlier, showed signs of recent use. Disturbed sediment, fresh marks where someone had moved through channels never meant for human passage. Ventilation shafts in multiple buildings had been accessed from inside. Grates had been replaced carefully, almost respectfully. Yet the metal held subtle signs of manipulation. The supply tunnel lock appeared secure, but on close inspection it had been picked and relocked, leaving microscopic scratches that only a determined eye would notice. Every entry point they found created a worse question. How many more hadn't been found? The fortress that had seemed impregnable the previous morning now felt porous, not because the infiltrators had created these weaknesses. They hadn't needed to. The holes had existed for years. All that had changed was that someone had finally understood them. The leadership losses made the pattern undeniable. The 3 dead officers weren't random casualties. They were senior tactical commanders, the men who understood operations, not just ceremony. And the gaps went beyond the dead. The Lord was still missing. The chief administrator who managed logistics and supply was nowhere to be found. The master of scouts who coordinated intelligence gathering had vanished as well. What remained was a structure with its decision-making organs removed. Junior officers could keep routine moving, but crisis required experience. The military commander, capable as he was, had lost the specialists he relied on. The castle still had soldiers, but it had been decapitated. They interrogated the guards who had collapsed and survived. It produced nothing. The men remembered standing their posts, then waking hours later with pounding heads and missing time. No one had seen an attacker. No one could describe a method. Whatever was used left no obvious trace, metabolizing quickly enough that by morning there was nothing to test, nothing to prove, nothing to point at. The messenger system was next. Investigators uncovered at least 7 false orders issued through the night, commands that used correct terminology, proper phrasing, and apparently legitimate seals. They sent troops to the wrong places, created contradictory deployments, scattered the very people meant to bind the castle together. The seals were real, stolen from administrative offices where they were kept. Someone had not only entered those rooms, someone had the skill to use official stamps in a way that produced documents that looked authentic enough to move armed men. Even beyond the walls, the disruption continued. At dawn, 3 messengers were sent to allied clans requesting assistance. None arrived. Search parties found 2 dead on the road, killed efficiently, bodies hidden just well enough that casual travelers would pass without noticing. The message was clear. Leaving the castle didn't make you safer. The 3rd messenger was found alive, shaken, insisting he had delivered his message to an allied representative. But verification came back. No message had been received. Either he had been deceived by someone impersonating an official, or he had been compromised and was lying. Neither possibility offered relief. Then came the inventory of the administrative offices. No forced entry, no smashed locks, no obvious theft. Yet careful records revealed missing items, maps showing Allied troop positions, correspondence discussing political alignments, financial ledgers outlining resources and debts. Nothing taken would cripple the castle immediately. Everything taken would be valuable to an enemy planning what came next. But what unsettled the investigators most wasn't what was missing. It was what had been left behind. A single document sat prominently on the chief administrator's desk, placed, not forgotten, listing every defensive weakness the infiltrators had exploited. Not a demand, not a threat, a demonstration. They wanted the garrison to understand how thoroughly the castle had been penetrated, how completely its security had failed. The garrison itself, though numerically intact, was organizationally shattered. Units that once moved as cohesive teams now felt like clusters of individuals, watching each other. Orders went out and were followed slowly, cautiously, as though each command might be a trap. The rigid discipline that made samurai forces effective had been replaced by hesitation, and hesitation turned every action into delay. Supply assessments offered the same bleak arithmetic. The contaminated well meant relying on emergency water sources that couldn't support a full garrison for long. Cut bowstrings reduced archery capability until replacements arrived. Men recovering from contaminated rations reduced available manpower. Each issue was manageable in isolation. Together, they formed strategic weakening that would take weeks to repair. And still, the strangest fact remained unchanged. Lord Uesugi Kagetora's forces, whom everyone now assumed had sponsored the operation though no proof existed, had not moved. No army marched, no siege appeared, no camps formed on the horizon. The attackers had achieved comprehensive advantage without committing a single conventional resource. That realization settled like ash. Fewer than 30 infiltrators had neutralized a garrison of 300. Castle Mizukage consumed enormous resources to maintain. Hundreds of personnel, constant supply, daily expense. The attacking force had operated for months on a budget that likely equaled less than a week of the castle's upkeep. By midday, the commander had to acknowledge what everyone was thinking, but no one wanted to say out loud. Castle Mizukage had been defeated, not captured, not destroyed, neutralized. Its walls stood unbreached. Most of its soldiers still breathed. And yet its capacity to project power, defend territory, or threaten an enemy had been stripped away without a single conventional battle. The victory wasn't measured in land seized or bodies counted. It was measured in capability destroyed, leadership removed, organization disrupted, confidence shattered. The castle could not function as a strategic asset again until it was rebuilt, not just in stone, but in systems, discipline, and belief. And the most terrifying question wasn't what had happened here. It was whether the same operation could be repeated against any castle in Japan, and whether the samurai had any defense at all against wars they could not see. News of Castle Mizukage's paralysis spread through the region within days, carried by merchants, traveling monks, and the few messengers who managed to reach allied domains. The story grew with each retelling. Some versions inflated the deaths, others slipped into superstition. But the core remained consistent, and it was enough. A fortified garrison had been neutralized in a single night by an enemy no one could see. The psychological impact hit harder than any defeat in recent memory. When armies clashed and one side fell, there was cause and effect you could name. Numbers, tactics, terrain, even bad luck. The losers could identify the mistake and imagine a correction. Mizukage offered no such clarity. They had followed doctrine, kept discipline, held walls, armed men, and still they were undone by methods that seemed impossible to answer. Every daimyo in the region understood the implication immediately. If it could happen to Takeda, it could happen to anyone. The walls they had paid for, the garrisons they maintained, the architecture designed to stop armies, suddenly all of it looked incomplete. Castles were built to resist mass. They were not built to stop individuals who could slip through narrow spaces and move like water through cracks in stone. Military thinking shifted, fast and quietly. Honor, so central to samurai identity, was not erased. That would have been culturally impossible. But it was downgraded from absolute law to something more conditional. Honor still mattered in public, in formal relations between recognized peers. It still shaped ceremonies and reputations, but security became paramount. Lords who had once condemned infiltration as beneath them began seeking their own contacts with shinobi networks. Never openly, never directly. Always through intermediaries, with the same plausible deniability they had criticized in others. The hypocrisy was obvious. It was also necessary. You couldn't defend against shadow warfare using only honorable methods. Survival demanded adaptation, even if it required swallowing contradiction. The market for intelligence exploded. Villages known for producing skilled operatives received offers from multiple lords at once. Prices rose. What had been marginal work practiced by a few communities became a strategic resource capable of deciding regional power, and fear itself became a weapon. Daimyo began leveraging the mere threat of shinobi operations in negotiations. The implication that your water could be corrupted, your officers removed, your castle turned inward against itself. Sometimes that threat achieved political objectives without any operation being carried out at all. Lord Uesugi, whether he had sponsored Mizukage or not, gained influence simply from the perception that he could. Castle security transformed almost overnight. Guard rotations were randomized. Servant backgrounds were investigated, water sources were monitored at multiple levels, administrative documents were kept under armed watch, lords stopped sleeping in predictable rooms, shifting locations to reduce the chance of a clean extraction or assassination. The cost was enormous, financially and worse, psychologically. To sustain that level of vigilance required doubling or tripling guard forces, hiring specialists to test food and water, conducting constant inspections, building redundant systems for basic functions. Castles that had once run with efficiency became clogged with procedures that slowed everything. Living under constant surveillance changed people. Trust in long-time servants eroded. Familiar corridors began to feel exposed. Sleeping in different rooms each night, listening for sounds that might be nothing, made rest impossible. Some lords began to see threats everywhere, punishing on suspicion rather than proof. Violence not from war, but from fear. Even within the samurai class, the response fractured. Traditionalists insisted honor was worth the risk, that abandoning Bushido would collapse the boundary between warrior and bandit. Pragmatists argued honor meant nothing if you were dead, and that refusing to adapt was suicide dressed as virtue. The debate sharpened into a generational divide. Older samurai, built by tradition, felt betrayed by younger men willing to embrace covert methods. The younger saw their elders as dangerously naive, clinging to a worldview that Mizukage had already shattered. Both sides had a point, and the inability to reconcile them created internal weakness that made clans more vulnerable than any external enemy. Training began to change. Samurai learned to watch for tampering, to test food before eating, to verify messengers through challenge-response protocols. But it was defensive training, meant to reduce vulnerability, not to create mastery of the same invisible methods. The strategic balance shifted. Conventional strength mattered, but intelligence began to matter more. A lord with superior networks could nullify a larger force by anticipating movement, compromising supplies, or removing leadership before an army ever formed into ranks. Visible martial display, armor, banners, drills became secondary to invisible cultivation of information. New power structures formed alongside the official hierarchy. Merchants who controlled information gained influence without rank. Village elders who coordinated shinobi networks became assets courted by multiple lords. The real map of power no longer perfectly matched the political map drawn on paper. The precedent was established. Invisible warfare was now legitimate, not acknowledged, not celebrated, not named in official terms, but accepted. Domains expanded their intelligence capabilities quietly and urgently. The shadow war that once lived at the margins moved toward the center of conflict. Denied in public, relied on in private. Castle Mizukage became a symbol. It was restored. Lord Takeda was ransomed back. Routine resumed, but nothing returned to what it had been. The garrison lived with the knowledge that they had been comprehensively defeated without landing a single blow. That scar didn't heal cleanly. The castle's reputation as a secure stronghold never fully recovered. Other lords learned from Mizukage what to fear and what was possible. The techniques that broke Takeda became templates elsewhere. The failures were studied. Defenses improved, though whether those improvements would truly hold remained untested. And the deepest change wasn't tactical. It was conceptual. The samurai had believed war was visible, force meeting, visible force. This night proved that the decisive battles were often the ones no one saw, fought by people whose names would never be recorded, using methods officially denied even as they became universally practiced. The night at Castle Mizukage ended with dawn, but its consequences never stopped unfolding. What began as a single operation became a permanent shift in how power worked in feudal Japan. The fear that seized the garrison that night didn't fade. It was institutionalized, systematized, and absorbed into the ordinary functioning of authority. Within a year, major castles across the region underwent architectural redesign. Not to raise walls or strengthen gates, those defenses had already been exposed as irrelevant, but to close the quiet vulnerabilities infiltrators had used. Drainage systems were rebuilt with grates too narrow for human passage. Ventilation shafts gained internal barriers. Supply tunnels were sealed or placed under heavy guard. Servant quarters were moved farther from administrative wings. These changes were expensive and disruptive. Months of construction, massive allocation of resources. But the alternative, remaining exposed to what had happened at Mizukage, felt unthinkable. Any lord who refused to modernize risked becoming the next cautionary tale carried in merchant gossip and warrior warnings. Guard forces multiplied beyond any reasonable military necessity. Castles that once held with 50 guards now employed 200. Not because threats had grown proportionally, but because the threat had changed shape. It demanded constant surveillance everywhere at once. Guards watched other guards. Servants were monitored by dedicated observers whose only duty was to look. Every corridor, every doorway, every room where power was exercised gained permanent coverage. The economic burden was staggering. Maintaining swollen security forces consumed resources once used for expansion, infrastructure, or patronage. But the logic was blunt. You can't project strength outward if you can be dismantled from within at any moment. Surveillance didn't stay confined to the military. It spread into daily life, creating new forms of social control. Servants lived under constant observation, movements tracked, conversations monitored, backgrounds investigated with growing suspicion. Household rule shifted from paternal authority to suspicious management. Trust was replaced by verification, and verification required bureaucracy that recorded everything. Villages near castles fell under heightened scrutiny. Communities suspected of producing shinobi faced collective punishment. Heavier taxation, forced relocations, restrictions on travel and trade. The reasoning was preventive. Cut the roots, end the threat. The reality was harsher. Punishment bred resentment, and resentment fed resistance, tightening the cycle of suspicion. Paranoia became self-sustaining. Each security measure created new vulnerabilities that demanded additional measures. More guards meant more people who could be compromised. More surveillance meant more information that needed to be processed, creating bottlenecks. More verification slowed communication, producing inefficiencies that could themselves be exploited. And while castles tried to harden themselves, espionage shifted from the margins toward the center of power. What had once been informal networks of independent operators became organized services controlled by major lords. The Tokugawa shogunate, when it later unified Japan, perfected this model, absorbing shinobi capability into state function while publicly maintaining the fiction that such practices did not exist. The Metsuke system emerged from that transformation. Official inspectors with legal authority to investigate, monitor, and report directly to the shogun. Their methods mirrored what independent shinobi had long practiced: covert surveillance, infiltration, information gathering. Only now those methods carried state legitimacy. What had been condemned as dishonorable when performed by hired operatives became administrative necessity when performed by government agents. The shinobi themselves faced a choice: adapt or disappear. Some networks tried to remain independent, still selling services to provincial lords engaged in covert competition. They were eliminated gradually, rarely through dramatic confrontations, more often through patient intelligence work that identified members, tracked operations, and neutralized them one by one. Others were absorbed. Their skills remained valuable, but the independence that made them dangerous also made them desirable to control. Former infiltrators became security agents. Intelligence gatherers became investigators. The transition was never announced. People simply vanished into bureaucratic roles, their backgrounds unspoken, their work unnamed. This absorption ended shinobi as an independent force. The invisible warriors who had operated between domains serving multiple clients and protecting autonomy through anonymity, were replaced by state systems that monopolized covert action. The techniques survived. The practitioners lost their independence, and with it, much of their mystique. The fear weaponized at Mizukage became a tool of governance. Power was maintained not only through visible force, but through the constant possibility of invisible consequence. Step out of line and your trade might fail, your family might fall under suspicion, your life might fill with obstacles that couldn't be traced to any single hand, and yet felt unmistakably deliberate. The system worked because it was unfalsifiable. Were operatives truly watching you, or was the threat only implied? Were your troubles punishment or coincidence? The uncertainty enforced compliance. When you can't separate paranoia from legitimate danger, the safest choice is to behave as though you are always observed. The cultural shift was profound. The samurai had built identity on visible courage, martial prowess, honorable conduct, open confrontation. But the world after Mizukage rewarded different skills: discretion, surveillance, information control, the ability to exert pressure without revealing the mechanism. The men who rose weren't always the finest fighters. They were the best at managing what others couldn't see. By the time the Tokugawa shogunate consolidated power in the early 17th century, the transformation was complete. Japan had moved from competing domains, fighting visible wars, to a political order shaped by monitoring, covert action, and the threat of unseen consequence, maintaining stability more effectively than open battle ever had. Castle Mizukage faded into history. The details blurred, confused with rumor, pulled toward legend, but the lessons remained: vulnerability, fear, vigilance, invisible warfare. The night ended, but the world it created never stopped. Fear won, not because it was loud, but because it became normal, because it shifted from an acute crisis into a chronic condition, because people stopped noticing they were afraid once fear became the air they breathed. The samurai wanted to be remembered for visible courage and honorable conduct. Instead, they helped build a system where the most effective power was the kind no one ever saw, and that invisible power shaped Japan far more than any battlefield victory ever could. That night proved something terrifying. An enemy you can't see doesn't need to defeat you. He only needs to make you afraid to move. Would you rather face an enemy on the battlefield, or one you never see? Comment below.